My husband's best friend's actions made me cringe Reddit accounts of infidelity. Before continuing the story, I ask you for a second to give a like to the video. It doesn't bother you at all and it helps me a lot. Let's continue. It all started on a quiet night after the soccer game. My husband came home in the company of two unfamiliar friends. That night, what happened transformed my way of seeing things permanently. In this story we will investigate the events of that night that generated uncertainty in everyone present. My husband has always been characterized as a serene person, without ups and downs or eccentricities, opting for a stable life. I thought our connection was strong, but in the end it was not. After so long, there was never a glimpse of him hiding any confidential information. Simplicity characterized our existence. During the course of the day, I focused on my responsibilities and my day-to-day life. By nightfall, we would come together in perfect harmony. That night, as usual, my husband left for soccer practice. On Saturdays he used to devote himself to that activity, taking a moment to relax and have a good time in the company of his loved ones. He stayed at my home. However, when he came back, he was not accompanied. Miguel and Ricardo, two companions unknown until then, accompanied him. My husband looked happy and introduced them to me while trying to remember if I had ever named them. I had never done it before. Despite their friendly, everyday appearance, something in their surroundings stood out in a peculiar way. I couldn't quite recognize what it was. After the soccer game, it was unusual for visitors to come, so I decided to keep quiet. I greeted each person present and a pleasant chat developed. Afterwards, I left to continue my work. In spite of everything, I felt a desire to stay close by, as I sensed that this night would be unique. The evening began as usual, but what happened next not only challenged my connection, but also challenged my own choices. After preparing some drinks upon returning to the lounge, I was struck by the radiant energy my husband displayed that I found complicated to comprehend. I thought my enthusiasm was solely due to the idea of enjoying Miguel and Ricardo's company. I sat next to him on the couch while the three of them exchanged soccer jokes. Up until that moment, everything seemed to be in order. That night I had nothing remarkable. Occasionally he would intervene in the conversation with a brief comment, but it was impossible for him not to notice something unusual. I'm not sure if it was his attitude or the way he expressed himself, but something didn't add up. Maybe it was his facial expression. From time to time, our eyes would meet as if he was waiting for something from me. I opted to downplay the importance. Perhaps he was simply in a good mood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until my husband's words transformed the atmosphere. Suddenly, he turned his gaze to Ricardo, broke into a smile and uttered a few words that provoked an immediate response within me. "Ricardo, did you realize that Isabel could have a very interesting conversation tonight?" At that instant, I experienced a sense of total stillness. The joyful sounds stopped. The verbal expressions were suspended in the atmosphere. I was trying to analyze the information received. "Could you repeat what you just mentioned? Was he making a joke? What was the reason for his words?" I turned to my husband in search of clues to confirm that it was a joke. Perhaps I was expecting to witness his laughter. However, his face reflected calm, even peace. There was no laughter or loud noises to be heard. He watched attentively, as if waiting for my reply. I watched my husband's companions carefully, trying to find out if they were informed about the current situation. Ricardo, whom he had addressed, exhibited total confusion. She remained calm without changing position as her glass swung from the table to her lips. Miguel remained impatient with his eyes fixed on the floor. In an instant, the atmosphere underwent a drastic transformation. The tension was palpable and impossible to ignore. I couldn't figure out whether she was upset, confused or scared. After what happened, my head was spinning in search of a logical explanation. What was the reason for her words? What is the meaning of all this? Is it a game? What is her expectation of my performance? Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any stranger, my husband calmly added something else that ended up disturbing the atmosphere even more. Of course I did, I affirm it with sincerity. I did feel a strong impact in my belly. It was not a joke, there was no secret intention. In the middle of a chat, I was showing a completely serious attitude, not understanding at all the meaning of the situation. The lack of sound in the room was disturbing. No one dared to utter a single word. Ricardo remained in a firm posture, while Miguel continued to look down, and I remained seated trying to understand the situation. That night became something out of the ordinary. After that statement, everything changed, the way I see my husband, our relationship, and even my own self-image. However, the evening unfolded in a surprising way. I had always proven to be a discreet person. So why was I acting this way at this moment? Why was I expressing those words in front of two people I had just met? I watched her eyes carefully for clues that would allow me to understand the situation. However, he maintained his composure as if he had everything under control. I experienced a moment of total isolation, feeling like the only person in the place. Thoughts were piling up in my mind. Is this a bad joke? Are you experimenting with something different? Do you have rabies for me? What is the expectation of my performance? Even though my mind was racing, my body remained motionless. Inside me there was a desire to get up and run away, to move to another room, to pretend this wasn't happening, to avoid getting involved in something I didn't understand. However, there was a faint voice in the corner of my mind whispering to me, "Stay in this place, observe what is happening and find out the motive behind their actions." It seemed that my desire to explore clashed with my urge to flee. I chose to observe my husband serenely. He held his glass, showing total contentment with the situation. My greatest concern lay in his total assurance that everything would turn out favorably. As if he had foreseen in advance the outcome of the evening. How could he be so sure? What was his goal in trying to prove it? It wasn't just him. Both subjects also caught my attention as I tried to find some indication that they were equally confused. Ricardo remained immovable, as if he had not yet chosen between bursting out laughing or running away. Miguel showed some discomfort, but his attitude showed a certain enthusiasm for what would happen next. What were they waiting for? What would be the best action to take in this situation? With my arms folded, I tried my best to remain calm. I had no plans to give up so quickly. I had no intention of expressing that I was at a loss. I chose to remain silent, behaving as if I were oblivious to the events. As if I was not impacted in the slightest. Nevertheless, my inner self was in a state of disarray. Once again, my husband fixed his eyes on me. On this occasion, his way of communicating had undergone a transformation. It was not an amusement, it was not a mockery. He seemed to have certain expectations of me, which I found somewhat confusing. What concept did he have in mind? What alternatives were available to me? At that instant, my understanding was limited to the realization that, despite trying to object, I was already involved in whatever idea he was scheming. It was impossible to turn back. The questions continued to fill my head. However, his situation was slowly deteriorating. I found it increasingly difficult to control my breathing. I was looking for answers, but I couldn't bring myself to ask questions. So he took an action that stunned me. Slowly standing up, my husband stood up, without a word, ignoring his companions. He approached me with a quiet step. He was so close that he leaned down and whispered something in a low, barely audible voice. "Have faith in me." With only 3 words, I managed to stop the storm of thoughts in my mind. His voice conveyed a calmness that seemed to indicate something to me without saying it directly. I experienced a confusing amalgam of feelings in that instant. At first, I considered asking him to stop teasing me. However, the firmness of his gaze gave me pause. I had never exhibited impulsive behavior before. If he was taking this action, there had to be a valid reason. The expressions he had said kept echoing in my thoughts. "Have faith in me." Despite the complication of the situation, I was forced to make this decision with no apparent alternatives. It seemed as if that message was being communicated to me. Despite the unusual and annoying nature of the situation, it had a reason for being. Although I did not know what it was, I chose to give it the benefit of uncertainty. As I found myself tucked against the back of the sofa, I took a deep breath of air. I didn't plan to escape or continue to resist. I opted to abide by his instructions, despite my confusion at the situation. I was intrigued to know what was the limit to which this circumstance could lead. Inside me there was a desire to place my trust in him. They had reached a point of no turning back from those 3 expressions. I began a process that would transform my perception of my husband and myself. After a long period of time, I finally experienced the sensation of looking at him from a totally different perspective. Could you tell me the identity of this individual? The one who had been my companion for so long, now showed a changed appearance. A previously unknown sense of shelter took hold of me, something fascinating and disturbing at the same time. I opted to remain, not only to discover his purpose, but to learn the true identity of this individual. There remained enigmas that had yet to be unraveled before me, something that it was imperative to highlight. Although anxiety persisted, it was intermingled with an irresistible curiosity. At that instant I decided to make a determination that would have an impact on the situation. He had crossed the line. From that moment on, everything that happened would be impossible to change. As the evening progressed, everything began to transform, with a disconcerting serenity. My husband continued to share unconventional comments. At first, the prayers seemed innocuous. However, they always carried with them an ambiguity of meaning that led you to wonder if there was something veiled. At first, Miguel and Ricardo were tense and nervous. But little by little they began to relax, trying to get used to an environment that was difficult for them to understand. From my perspective, I was experiencing a whirlwind of feelings. The uncertainty generated anxiety and awakened an irresistible curiosity that I could not avoid. Why has all this happened? What is he interested in? Is he experimenting with something different, or is he just entertaining himself by playing with me? Finally, Miguel broke the silence with a soft laugh. He was the one who had spoken the least among the friends. From my point of view, this circumstance seems a little embarrassing, doesn't it? Swaying, I watched my husband. Ricardo tried to divert the conversation by talking about soccer, but my husband stopped him by raising his hand, as if he wanted to continue leading the conversation. With an unfriendly expression, he said, "Let's get on with it. I would love to engage in a conversation on a more captivating topic. I wish we could all be honest." The room fell silent once again. At his words, the 2 friends exchanged worried glances. While I noticed how my heart began to pound harder. Was that really what you had in your head? What kind of sincerity did I expect to find? I tried to keep my composure while biting my lip, but the atmosphere was becoming more and more unsettling. It gave the impression that we were immersed in a social experiment. A dynamic in which only my husband could intervene. My husband went on to ask Ricardo to share. "Tell me a little more, Ricardo. What was your impression when you met Isabel for the first time tonight?" Surprised by the question, Ricardo remained engrossed in his drink, looked at his husband, then at me, and finally at the floor. At Twiseman, he hesitated and showed concern as he asked if he really wanted me to say it. My husband calmly asked Richard to be honest before he knew his answer. I experienced tension invade my physical being. The passage of time seemed to have been suspended. I was amazed at the way my husband questioned his friends. I was convinced that any answer would disturb the tranquility of the evening. After taking a deep breath of air, Ricardo said, "I thought she was a woman of exceptional beauty." The way she spoke reflected a lack of confidence, as if she were holding back a scolding. The husband nodded his head as if he had already anticipated that answer. Then he turned his gaze to Miguel. "Miguel, what was your opinion on the matter?" Miguel, clearly annoyed, tried to show a smile to calm the tense atmosphere. He expressed with a gesture of indifference, "It seems to me that we are in agreement." I began to experience a strange feeling in my being. I wasn't sure if it was embarrassment, discomfort, or some other feeling. Each term contributed to worsen the atmosphere. I was looking for a way to interrupt the talk. Any excuse would do. However, inside me there was a lingering interest to find out more. What was my husband's spending limit? What was his goal in taking this action? There was a strong sense of tension in the air. However, my husband's next action totally transformed the picture. He stood up and placed his glass on the table with such accuracy that it gave the impression that he had planned it in advance. In the room, the silence was absolute. Every time he advanced towards the center, his footsteps echoed like an echo. He was the center of everyone's attention. Even I, who had struggled with my own thoughts, could not stop staring at him. His posture and the look he gave each of us indicated that he was about to make a crucial decision. I began to feel my heart beat faster. My thoughts were invaded by a combination of excitement and fear. What was the message you were about to convey? Would it be possible to ask them for a favor? With tranquility and sympathy, Carmen expressed. She turned her eyes to Miguel and Ricardo. I require your assistance tonight. My trust in you is reciprocal, as well as the trust you place in me. The two subjects looked at him with notorious perplexity, trying to understand what they had just heard. It was Miguel who spoke first. Would you be so kind as to give a more detailed explanation? He showed signs of anxiety. The smile my husband showed began to confuse the people around him. A smile that hid deeper feelings. In today's evening, there are no disguises and no secrets. I want everyone to express their opinion with complete honesty, even if it is uncomfortable for them. I felt a sense of pressure in my chest area. What was their objective? What would be the situation? What was the prediction of what would happen at that location? My head was trying to find answers, however, it was only raising more questions. The tension in the air felt like a pressure that affected all of us. I watched Miguel and Ricardo in an attempt to decipher what they were thinking. However, their expression reflected the same confusion as mine. My husband, as if sensing that he needed extra incentive, turned slightly toward me. There is no reason to worry. This is not an academic paper. With a broad smile on his face, he said, I hope Isabel and I can support each other at all times. After uttering those words, she turned her gaze to me. I experienced a transformation. I was no longer simply an observer. At that moment, I was totally immersed, although I did not understand in what way. At that moment, my husband made a choice that transformed the entire course of the evening. He approached Miguel and spoke to him with a serenity that almost made me shiver. If you have faith in me, Miguel, please look toward Isabel. My eyes widened. I noticed an increase in my breathing rate. What activity was she in? As I pondered, Michael watched with an expression of disbelief, as if I had asked him for something unattainable. Ricardo found himself unable to conceal his anxiety. My own mind was torn between uncertainty and curiosity. My whole body was on alert, but I found it impossible to make any movement or produce any noise. The tension was becoming unbearable. Miguel hesitated, looked at my husband and then at me. After taking a deep breath, he slowly stood up. He approached my position and then stopped his pace to direct his gaze at Ricardo as if guarding his consent. The husband chose not to speak and watched the scene with a serenity on his face that was beginning to unsettle those present. He seemed to understand that, at the end of the day, his requests would be taken into account. At that moment I had the feeling that everything was about to collapse. Miguel was about to perform an action that none of us could fully understand. It seemed that Ricardo was about to take the floor while her husband just watched, as if everything was happening just as he had anticipated. At that moment, I realized that the night was irremediably approaching its point of no return. Inside the room there was an unusual atmosphere. Miguel had approached me, but chose to stop and reflect on the circumstance. Ricardo remained motionless, holding his glass as he turned his gaze toward our group. My husband remained unperturbed and serene as if he was aware of what would happen next. The atmosphere was so thick that it was hard for me to breathe normally. At that moment, my husband approached and, maintaining the serenity he had shown throughout the evening, he resigned a few words that made it evident that this circumstance exceeded what we had imagined. Tonight goes beyond words. Confidence is fundamental in overcoming our fears and venturing into experiences we would usually reject. When my eyes met Miguel's and Ricardo's, I experienced a shiver run down my spine. That night, I had no uncertainty. I was determined to push boundaries I had never dared to cross before. My hands were trembling slightly. I experienced my heart pounding so intensely that its beats seemed audible to those around me. I was uncertain about their readiness to face the situation. However, as I met my husband's gaze, I sensed something in his expression that caused me to point deeply. He whispered again, "Trust me." That simple phrase seemed to have the ability to clear up all my uncertainties. After reviewing it carefully, I finally agreed. Thus, everything underwent a total transformation. The tension that had gripped the meeting began to evolve into something new, an emotionally charged environment with a passionate gaze. I watched as my husband placed his hands on my shoulders, gently leading me towards Miguel and Ricardo, who were slowly approaching, as if waiting for a signal that had already been given to them. At first, the situation was awkward, but quickly became more tense. It was my husband who took the reins. He would indicate the pace while the others continued to move forward. Gradually, any hint of uncertainty disappeared. Never before had I felt such a mixture of vulnerability and freedom as I experienced in that unique moment of my life. Miguel placed his hands on my waist while Ricardo stood nearby. His face showed a nervous expression full of longing. Everything was permeated by the strength of that intensity. My husband kept looking at me with an expression of satisfaction and happiness on his face. I watched as everything went perfectly according to plan. As the night wore on, the barriers that divided us vanished completely. Shame had no place, only longing, togetherness, and security. It turned out to be a completely different experience from anything I had previously experienced. It generated in me a unique and unparalleled sense of energy. Calm returned once everything in the room was completed. Miguel and Ricardo settled comfortably on the sofa, exchanging glances that conveyed feelings beyond what words could communicate. My husband grabbed my hand and watched me as if to confirm that I was feeling well. The situation was resolved magnificently. I nodded with a smile on my face. "Isabel, are you sure?" Carmen asked as she brushed a piece of hair away from my face. Trust is the foundation of everything. Being united no matter what happens is something we can always count on. Although not much was yet to be examined, I managed to understand what she wanted to convey. That night not only changed our connection, but also the way I viewed my husband, myself, and everything we thought we knew about love and trust. That night we crossed boundaries I could never have imagined crossing. The moment Miguel and Ricardo walked through the door, a great calm pervaded the house. The nocturnal energy was still perceptible in the environment. For a moment, neither of us said a word. I remained on the couch reflecting on what had happened while he stood serenely by my side. He asked me about my condition, fixing his gaze on my eyes. As I nodded calmly, I knew that my face reflected a combination of emotions that was difficult to describe verbally. I replied by mentioning my current situation. At that instant, it was my husband who spoke. He carefully expressed that what he wanted that night was not limited to a simple experiment. "I would like us to understand an important point. When we genuinely trust, we overcome fear. When we trust in ourselves, we succeed in overcoming the obstacles we put in our way." The words he said began to make sense of every event of the evening. At first, it was inevitable to feel some discomfort. "There was no other way to convey this information to you," he said, noticing my discomfort. However, during our dialogue it became clear that what had happened could not be explained by the words you spoke. My husband longed for us to be able to experience that experience together. To live that experience in our own emotions. It was at that moment that we were able to understand the true interpretation. The conversation allowed us to reflect on the experiences we shared together. I noticed that the atypical night gave us the opportunity to grow together both in our relationship and individually. Sometimes the experiences we least anticipate are the ones that most influence our personal development. I learned an important lesson that night. Sometimes unexpected events propel us to grow, refine the way we communicate, and strengthen our relationships in ways we didn't expect. Trust transcends the mere definition of a word. It refers to an activity,